I always knew my father favored my younger sister, but never in my wildest nightmares did I imagine he would give away my house as if it were some meaningless trinket. That realization, however, was not even the most shocking part of that evening. No, the real moment of reckoning came when I saw the gleam of triumph in my sister's eyes as she made her announcement, standing there in her designer heels, with one manicured hand wrapped around the stem of a champagne flute, basking in the applause of our so-called loving family. That was the moment I realized they had all been in on it. The restaurant had been my choice, an intimate venue with soft lighting, warm wooden interiors, and a menu that I had carefully selected to include my favorite dishes. I had reserved the private dining area weeks in advance, thinking it would be a night of celebration, a night where my family would acknowledge me for once instead of treating me like a disposable afterthought. Instead, as I sat at the head of the long oak table, surrounded by the people who were supposed to care about me, I felt the walls closing in with every smug smile, every congratulatory toast, every unspoken betrayal hanging in the air. My sister, Amelia, had waited until the meal was nearly finished before dropping her little bombshell, right as the servers arrived with the decadent chocolate soufflé I had been looking forward to all evening. She clinked her spoon against her glass, the sound piercing through the murmur of conversation like a gunshot, and then, with the confidence of someone who had never known true struggle, she declared, "I have an exciting announcement to make. Dad gave me my sister's house as a gift." There was laughter. There was applause. There were cheers and raised glasses, as if this was some delightful joke instead of a blatant theft of the home I had spent years working for. I watched as my father beamed with pride, his arm around my mother, who nodded approvingly, oblivious or indifferent to the weight of his actions. My cousin leaned over to my aunt and whispered something, her eyes darting toward me as if waiting for my reaction, perhaps expecting me to cry, to plead, to make a fool of myself. I refused to give them that satisfaction. Instead, I smiled, took a slow sip of my wine, and let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uneasy. Then, in a voice so calm that even I was surprised by its steadiness, I set my glass down and said, "Perfect. Then you should all know." The tension that followed was almost comical. I could see my father's smile falter, a flicker of confusion crossing his face as he glanced at Amelia, who had started to shift uncomfortably in her seat. They had expected outrage, not composure. They had anticipated my devastation, not my absolute, unwavering certainty. I reached into my handbag and, with a deliberate slowness, pulled out a thick folder of documents, placing them on the table in front of me with a crisp, decisive sound that cut through the artificial warmth of the evening. My father's complexion paled instantly, the color draining from his face as his eyes locked onto the unmistakable letterhead of the legal firm printed across the top page. My mother, ever the silent accomplice, inhaled sharply, her perfectly manicured nails clutching at her pearl necklace, as if seeking comfort in its cool weight. "I'm sure you were all so eager to celebrate Amelia's newfound property that you didn't stop to wonder about the fine details," I continued, keeping my voice light, almost amused, as I watched the panic start to creep into my father's expression. "But since this is a night for big announcements, allow me to share one of my own." I slid the documents across the table, directly toward my father, who made no move to pick them up. His fingers twitched slightly, his entire body stiff with the kind of dread that only comes when a carefully laid scheme begins to unravel right before your eyes. Amelia, for all her bravado, was clearly struggling to maintain her composure, her gaze darting between me and the papers as if trying to make sense of what was happening. "The family business," I said, tapping the folder with one neatly trimmed nail, "the one that has kept this family financially comfortable for decades. The one I have managed single-handedly for the past 7 years while Amelia flitted around the world spending inheritance that wasn't hers yet." I paused for effect, letting the weight of my words settle before delivering the final blow. "Well, it's mine now." The reaction was instantaneous. My father, a man who prided himself on control, on power, on always being the one with the final word, let out a strangled sound somewhere between a gasp and a curse. His hands, which had always been steady even in the most ruthless of business negotiations, trembled as he finally reached for the papers, his eyes scanning the pages so quickly that I doubted he could even make sense of them. My mother looked at him, at me, at the documents, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to formulate a response, but coming up empty. Amelia, however, was not as restrained. "This is a joke," she scoffed, shaking her head as though trying to will away reality. "Dad, tell her this is a joke." But my father didn't respond. He was still staring at the papers, his jaw tightening, his nostrils flaring, the muscles in his face twitching in a barely contained panic. Because he knew, just as I knew, that this was very real. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the power shift in the room, the weight of years of neglect, favoritism, and betrayal lifting from my shoulders. "No joke," I said, my smile widening as I reached for my wine glass again. "Just business." And as I took another sip, savoring the stunned silence that followed, I thought, for the first time in my life, that maybe, just maybe. For a long, stretched-out moment, the only sound in the restaurant was the clinking of ice against glass as someone absent-mindedly swirled their drink, the sound almost deafening in the suffocating silence that followed my announcement. My father, still clutching the legal documents with whitening knuckles, seemed frozen in place, his mouth slightly open as if he had started to say something but had lost the ability to form words. Across from him, my sister Amelia had gone rigid, her perfectly painted lips parting in disbelief, the soft golden glow of the candlelight doing nothing to soften the venomous glare she now directed at me. My mother, always the epitome of controlled grace and quiet calculation, had not spoken yet, though I noticed the delicate twitch in her fingers as she absent-mindedly adjusted the placement of her wedding ring. She was waiting, processing, calculating the best way to maneuver through the chaos I had just unleashed, likely determining whether it was more beneficial to side with my father or to feign sympathy toward me. I knew that expression well. I had spent my entire life watching her play the role of the careful diplomat, always choosing the path of least resistance, always prioritizing appearances over truth. It was Amelia who spoke first, slamming her champagne flute down on the table with a force that sent liquid sloshing over the rim, tiny golden droplets splattering onto the crisp white tablecloth. Her breath came in sharp, uneven bursts, her carefully maintained composure starting to crack at the edges. "You're lying," she hissed, her voice laced with something between desperation and disbelief, her eyes flicking between me and our father as though waiting for him to refute everything I had just said. "This is some pathetic attempt to ruin my moment because you're bitter and jealous that Dad chose to give me the house instead of you." I tilted my head slightly, letting her words settle in the air between us, feeling the raw, unfiltered satisfaction of watching her squirm under the weight of a reality she was wholly unprepared for. For years, Amelia had coasted through life under the delusion that our father's favoritism meant she was untouchable, that no matter how little she contributed, no matter how irresponsibly she behaved, someone else, whether it was our parents, their lawyers, or me, would always clean up her messes. Tonight, for the first time, she was seeing the cracks in that illusion, and she had no idea what to do with that revelation. I leaned forward, resting my elbows against the table, my fingers lacing together as I locked eyes with her, my expression unyielding. "You can keep trying to convince yourself this is a lie, Amelia," I said, my voice quiet but firm, the weight of years of quiet resentment threading through every syllable. "But unless you think I somehow forged these documents and had them notarized by our father's own attorneys, I suggest you start accepting the truth." I saw the flicker of uncertainty in her gaze, brief but telling. Amelia had always been many things: entitled, manipulative, reckless, but she was not entirely stupid. She knew I wouldn't have made a claim like this without having the legal backing to support it, and that knowledge was starting to settle into her bones, twisting through her like poison. Across the table, my father finally moved, exhaling a sharp breath as he placed the documents down with shaky hands, his eyes dark and unreadable as he looked at me for the first time since I had spoken. He had aged in the past few minutes, the weight of his mistake, of underestimating me, settling into his features like cracks forming in the surface of a fragile sculpture. "I don't know what you think you've done," he said slowly, his voice a careful blend of irritation and forced authority, as though he still believed he could control the situation if he spoke firmly enough. "But this," he gestured to the papers on the table with a dismissive flick of his wrist, "isn't going to change anything. This business has always belonged to me, and no amount of legal maneuvering is going to make you the rightful owner of something I built from the ground up." I smiled, though there was no warmth in it, only cold, precise satisfaction. "I never disputed that you built it, Dad," I said, allowing the words to land deliberately, watching as his jaw clenched slightly. "But the fact remains that for the past 7 years, I have been the one running it, growing it, making it more profitable than it ever was under your leadership. While you and Amelia were too busy throwing money at pointless vanity projects and lavish vacations, I was making sure our employees got paid on time, I was negotiating contracts that saved us from bankruptcy, and I was ensuring that our biggest investors continued to believe in this company's future. And because of that, because you were too preoccupied with everything except the business you claim to love, you signed away controlling interest to me without even realizing what you were doing." I saw it then, the precise moment when my father understood the full depth of his mistake. His body went unnaturally still, his face a careful mask of indifference, but his fingers curled slightly against the table, his breathing just a fraction too controlled. He was trying not to panic, but the truth was already digging its claws into him, sinking deep into the fabric of everything he had once believed to be unshakable. My mother reached for his hand, her nails pressing lightly against his wrist, a silent attempt to ground him before he said something he couldn't take back. "You never mentioned any of this," she murmured, her tone softer, more measured, the first crack in her well-maintained neutrality beginning to form. "Of course I didn't," I said, arching an eyebrow at her, tilting my head slightly. "If I had, do you really think Dad would have signed the documents as easily as he did?" My father's mouth tightened into a thin line, his nostrils flaring slightly as the reality of my words sank in. He had signed them without reading them carefully, trusting that, like always, I would never do anything to act against his interests. He had assumed I was loyal, that I was predictable, that I would always be the obedient daughter who sacrificed without question while Amelia reaped all the rewards. He had been wrong. Very, very wrong. I leaned back, picking up my glass of wine once more, taking a slow sip as I let my gaze sweep across the table, taking in every stunned, horrified, and panicked expression around me. Amelia's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out, her mind undoubtedly racing as she tried to make sense of everything. My mother kept glancing between my father and me, waiting for him to fix this, waiting for him to find a way to undo what had already been cemented in legal stone. And my father? My father looked like a man who had just realized, far too late, that he had never been the smartest person in the room. I had spent years waiting for this moment, though I never imagined it would arrive in the form of my father staring down at legal documents that proved he had unknowingly signed away control of the very business he had once built with his bare hands. There was something almost poetic about the way his fingers trembled as he turned the pages, as though willing the ink to shift, the contracts to dissolve, reality itself to rewrite the last few months and undo what had already been sealed by his own negligence. Across the table, my sister Amelia still looked as though she had swallowed broken glass, her carefully composed facade cracking further with each breath she took, her eyes darting wildly between our father and me as if one of us might suddenly announce that this was all some cruel, elaborate joke. My mother had not yet spoken again, but her silence was not the comforting, strategic neutrality she usually adopted in moments of family conflict. No, this was something else, something rawer, something closer to the realization that for the first time in her carefully curated life, she had no idea how to fix what had been broken. "You can't seriously think this is over," my father finally muttered, his voice lower now, not the booming, authoritative tone he had always used to control rooms, but something quieter, something forced, something desperate. You might have found a way to manipulate the legal technicalities, but there's more to running a business than just owning the damn thing. I tilted my head slightly, studying him, watching the way his jaw clenched, the way the vein in his temple twitched just slightly with barely contained rage. He still thought he had an upper hand. He still believed that, even stripped of ownership, stripped of power, stripped of control, he could somehow intimidate me into surrendering everything I had fought to claim. "I'm well aware of what it takes to run this business, Dad," I said calmly, allowing my voice to remain steady, measured, unwavering, because I knew that nothing would rattle him more than my complete and utter lack of fear. "After all, I've been the one running it for years while you and Amelia treated it like a personal cash machine." Amelia scoffed loudly, crossing her arms over her chest in a feigned display of defiance, though the slight shake in her hands gave her away. "Oh, please," she spat, rolling her eyes, attempting to summon the arrogance she had wielded so effortlessly before. "You act like you've done something impressive when all you really did was cheat your way into stealing something that wasn't yours." I almost laughed at the sheer irony of her statement, the audacity of it, the breathtaking lack of self-awareness required for someone who had just announced that she had been gifted my house to now claim that I had stolen something that belonged to someone else. Instead, I took another slow sip of my wine, watching as she bristled at my silence, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to give her something to fight against. "You might want to be careful with your words, Amelia," I said finally, setting my glass down deliberately, folding my hands neatly on the table in front of me. "Because if we're going to have a conversation about theft, then perhaps we should also discuss how Dad conveniently transferred ownership of my house to you, despite the fact that I paid for every single renovation, handled every single mortgage payment, and was the only one who ever actually lived there." For the first time that evening, I saw a flicker of doubt cross my father's face, the barest hint of hesitation in his otherwise impenetrable mask. My mother's fingers twitched against her napkin, her lips pressing together in a thin, colorless line, and I knew that they had not expected me to challenge that. They had expected outrage, yes, maybe even tears, but they had not expected precision. They had not expected preparedness. They had not expected that I would know exactly how to dismantle them piece by piece. "That house was always meant to be a part of Amelia's future," my mother interjected, her voice smooth, carefully modulated, as though she thought she could still play the role of peacekeeper in a war she had helped orchestrate. "You've always been so independent, so capable. You didn't need it the way she does." I exhaled slowly, shaking my head just slightly, marveling at the sheer audacity of her words, the casual way she dismissed everything I had done, everything I had sacrificed for them. "That's fascinating," I murmured, allowing my words to settle in the air for a moment before continuing. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like Amelia has never needed anything, because you've all spent your lives handing her everything on a silver platter while I was left to fend for myself." Amelia opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. "But since you believe in fairness," I continued, reaching into my bag once more and pulling out another set of neatly stacked documents, this time placing them directly in front of my sister, whose expression twisted with a mixture of confusion and unease. "Let's talk about what you actually own, because I went ahead and had a full audit of the business finances conducted before finalizing the transfer of ownership, and you might find the results very, very interesting." I tapped the top page lightly, waiting as Amelia hesitated before snatching up the papers, her eyes scanning the text, her brow furrowing deeper with every passing second. I already knew what she was reading, because I had memorized every single word, every single number, every single damning statistic. "What is this?" she finally muttered, her voice thinner now, her confidence cracking with each passing second. I smiled, not kindly. "That, dear sister, is a detailed record of every unauthorized withdrawal, every misallocated fund, every single luxury expense that you funneled through the company over the past 3 years," I said smoothly, watching as the color drained from her face, as the reality of what she had done finally began to settle in. And because the business is now solely under my control, that means I have full discretion over how to handle, let's call them, financial discrepancies. My father inhaled sharply, his head snapping toward Amelia as though seeing her for the first time, as though only now realizing that the golden child he had spent his entire life protecting had been bleeding his empire dry behind his back. "You used company money?" he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes dark with something dangerously close to betrayal. Amelia swallowed hard, looking between us now, searching for an escape, for an excuse, for a way to twist the narrative back in her favor. But there was no escape, no excuse, no rewriting history this time. For once in her life, Amelia had to answer for her mistakes, and I was going to make damn sure she did. The silence that followed my revelation was heavier than any storm I had ever weathered, pressing down on the room with a suffocating weight that no amount of denial could lift. My father, once the picture of controlled authority, looked as though he had aged a decade in the span of a few minutes, his features twisted in something between fury and disbelief as he stared at Amelia with an expression I had never seen before, something bordering on actual disappointment. Amelia, on the other hand, was unraveling right in front of us, her perfectly constructed image crumbling under the weight of cold, hard reality. The pages she had gripped so tightly just moments ago now lay scattered on the table in front of her, her hands trembling slightly as she processed the magnitude of what I had just exposed. For years, she had lived under the delusion that her actions would never have consequences, that she could siphon money out of the family business without a second thought because Dad would always clean up the mess for her. Tonight, she was realizing, in real time, that there was no one left to protect her. "You set me up," she finally hissed, her voice sharp with accusation, her eyes burning with a mixture of panic and hatred as she turned to glare at me, as if I were somehow responsible for her own reckless financial choices. "You dug through the accounts, twisted the numbers, and made it look like I did something wrong." I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, watching her as if she were an actress in a play I had already seen the ending to, the inevitable collapse of her performance both predictable and pathetic. "I didn't have to twist anything, Amelia," I said, keeping my tone calm, even, perfectly controlled, because I knew that nothing would infuriate her more than my absolute refusal to be rattled by her dramatics. "The numbers don't lie. Every lavish vacation, every designer shopping spree, every first-class flight you took under the guise of business travel, it's all documented, all traced back to company funds." My father inhaled sharply, his fists clenching on the table, his knuckles white against his skin. "Tell me this isn't true," he demanded, his voice low, dangerous, teetering on the edge of something volatile as he turned his glare toward Amelia, his entire body rigid with barely contained fury. "Tell me you didn't steal from your own family's company, from the business I built with my own hands." For the first time in her life, Amelia looked small. I had spent years watching her dominate every room she walked into, basking in the warmth of our father's approval, reveling in the unshakable certainty that no matter what she did, no matter how badly she failed, someone else would always be there to fix it. But there was no fixing this. She had pushed too far, taken too much, and the moment she realized she wasn't going to talk her way out of it was written all over her face. "Dad, I didn't mean to," she stammered, her voice losing its usual sharp edge, softening into something almost childlike as she reached for him, desperate to pull him back into the role he had always played for her, the protector, the enabler, the father who had never let her suffer the weight of her own mistakes. "It wasn't stealing. I borrowed it. I thought I'd pay it back eventually." "Borrowed?" My father repeated the word like it tasted foul on his tongue, his nostrils flaring, his breathing sharp and uneven. "Do you even hear yourself? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Amelia's gaze darted to my mother, desperate now, pleading, silently begging her to step in and smooth things over, to do what she had always done and make it all go away. But this time, my mother didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't defend her. She just sat there, her fingers twitching slightly against her napkin, her eyes flickering between my father and me, and for the first time, I saw something I had never seen before: doubt. She was realizing, slowly but surely, that the golden child was rusted through. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, my fingers interlocking, my eyes never leaving Amelia's face as I delivered the final blow. "Do you know what happens when an executive is caught misappropriating company funds?" I asked, my voice soft, almost conversational, watching as the color drained from her skin, her breath hitching as she swallowed hard. "There are legal consequences, Amelia. You didn't just use the company credit card a few too many times, you committed embezzlement." The word landed like a grenade. My father flinched, my mother's grip tightened around her napkin, and Amelia visibly recoiled as though I had just struck her across the face. "No," she breathed, shaking her head, her voice barely more than a whisper. "No, that's not, I didn't." "Yes, you did." I cut her off, my voice sharper now, leaving no room for argument, no space for her to claw her way out of the mess she had made. "And if you think I'm going to risk my company's reputation, my reputation, to cover for you, then you are even more delusional than I thought." Amelia shot out of her chair so fast that her wine glass nearly toppled, her face twisted in fury, her hands shaking with rage. "You're my sister," she spat, her voice breaking at the edges, her entire body vibrating with the weight of her impotent rage. "You can't do this to me." I rose slowly, mirroring her stance, my expression unreadable, my heartbeat steady, my hands still, my power absolute. "No, Amelia," I said, my voice quieter now, softer, almost pitying as I looked at her, truly looked at her, for what felt like the first time. "You did this to yourself." She stood there for a moment, her chest rising and falling in quick, uneven bursts, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to form a response, to say something, anything that could undo what had just been done. But there was nothing left to say. She had already lost. My father turned away from her then, running a hand down his face, his exhaustion palpable, his silence heavier than all the shouting in the world. My mother simply stared at the table, at the scattered documents, at the remnants of a carefully orchestrated life that had crumbled in the span of a single evening. And as I stepped back, smoothing my dress, picking up my bag, preparing to leave them to deal with the wreckage, I realized something for the first time in years. As I walked out of the restaurant that night, the sharp click of my heels against the polished floor echoed louder than any of the words that had been spoken inside. The weight that had sat on my shoulders for years, the burden of being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed, had finally lifted, replaced by something lighter, something freer, something dangerously close to satisfaction. Behind me, my family sat in stunned silence, their world crumbling beneath them, their carefully constructed lies exposed under the harsh light of the truth they had spent so long avoiding. I stepped out into the cool evening air, inhaling deeply, letting the crispness of the night settle into my lungs as I pulled my coat tighter around my body. The city buzzed around me, a constant hum of distant conversations, passing cars, and the occasional burst of laughter from late-night revelers. The world was moving forward, oblivious to the collapse of the empire my father had once built, to the reckoning that had taken place over dinner. And for the first time in years, I was finally moving forward too. I had barely made it halfway down the block when my phone buzzed inside my purse, the familiar vibration against my fingertip signaling the inevitable fallout of my actions. I considered ignoring it, letting them stew in the mess they had created, but curiosity got the better of me. I reached into my bag, pulled out the device, and glanced at the screen. Unsurprisingly, it was my mother. Her name flashed across the display, the same name that had once brought comfort, but now felt like an obligation I was no longer willing to carry. I exhaled slowly, debating whether I was in the mood for whatever desperate plea or thinly veiled manipulation she was about to attempt. Deciding that I might as well face the storm head-on, I pressed accept and lifted the phone to my ear. "That was quite the performance," she said, her voice softer than usual, but laced with the same passive-aggressive edge she had mastered over the years. "I assume you feel proud of yourself for humiliating your sister in front of everyone?" I let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking my head slightly as I crossed the street. "Humiliating her?" I echoed, arching an eyebrow even though she couldn't see me. "Mother, Amelia humiliated herself the moment she decided to treat the company as her personal ATM and expected no one to notice." There was a brief pause on the other end, the sound of her sigh barely audible over the distant honk of a car passing by. "Your father is furious," she finally admitted, and though she tried to disguise it, I could hear the thin thread of worry woven into her words. "He won't say it, but I know this mess is affecting him more than he's letting on." I smirked slightly, stopping at the corner of the sidewalk as I glanced at my reflection in a nearby shop window. "Oh, I'm sure it is," I mused, tilting my head slightly as I adjusted the collar of my coat. "But I find it fascinating that you're calling me about his feelings instead of your daughter's obvious financial crimes." Another pause. Longer this time. "Amelia made some mistakes," my mother conceded, her voice measured, careful, as though each word had been selected with the precision of a chess move. "But this can't be how this ends. We're family, and family fixes things together. You need to be reasonable." Reasonable. I had spent years being reasonable, bending, compromising, sacrificing for the sake of a family that had never once extended the same courtesy to me. And now, after everything, my mother still thought she could talk me down, that she could manipulate me into cleaning up yet another one of Amelia's disasters. I exhaled slowly, tightening my grip on the phone as I finally replied. "You seem to be under the impression that I'm going to fix this for you," I said, my tone quiet but firm, sharp enough to leave no room for misinterpretation. "But let me make something very, very clear. I am done being the one who takes the fall so Amelia can continue to play pretend in a world where actions don't have consequences." My mother's breath hitched slightly, the first crack in her composure finally revealing itself, but before she could speak, I continued. "You and Dad have spent my entire life treating Amelia like she is entitled to everything while treating me like I should be grateful for whatever scraps are left over," I said, my voice unwavering, stronger now, filled with years of pent-up truth that had never been spoken aloud. "But this time, you chose to steal from me, to take my house, to strip me of something I worked for, something I built with my own hands. And in return, all I did was shine a light on what Amelia has been doing behind your backs." I could hear the shift in her breathing, the way her composure was slipping, unraveling thread by thread, her ability to control the situation diminishing by the second. "You have every right to be angry," she said finally, and for the first time in my entire life, I believed her. "But what do you want then? What's your end game here?" I smiled at the question, because for once, I had an endgame, and they weren't going to like it. "I want what's mine," I said simply, my voice steady, my decision absolute. "And that means my house, my business, and the absolute certainty that Amelia will no longer have access to a single cent of company money." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening, the weight of my words settling in like bricks against her chest. "And if your father refuses?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but I could hear the fear in it, the realization that this time, I wasn't bluffing. "Then he can lose everything," I said, my voice devoid of emotion, because at this point, I meant it. "Because I promise you, if you push me, I will take everything and leave you all with nothing." She inhaled sharply, a sound so small yet so telling, because for the first time, my mother, the woman who had spent her entire life orchestrating outcomes to suit her interests, knew she had lost control. "I'll talk to your father," she said finally, her voice quieter now, strained, like she was holding back something, regret, perhaps, or maybe just the weight of knowing she had finally pushed me too far. "Good," I said simply, before pulling the phone away from my ear and pressing end call. And as I stood there, under the bright lights of the city, I realized something profound. I had spent my entire life watching my father control every situation with absolute certainty, watching my mother smooth over every crisis with carefully crafted diplomacy, watching my sister walk through life without a single moment of accountability for her actions. But for the first time, I had shattered their illusion of control, stripped them of the power they had wielded over me for years, and forced them to sit in the wreckage of their own making. And the most satisfying part of all? There was nothing they could do to stop me. The following morning, I received an email from my father's attorney, a man who had spent years pretending to be impartial while conveniently siding with whatever benefited my father the most. The message was as formal as it was predictable, an invitation to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution to the current misunderstanding. I nearly laughed at the sheer audacity of it, as though what had happened last night was some minor miscommunication rather than the unraveling of decades of entitlement and corruption. I responded in kind, keeping my reply short, professional, and deliberately non-negotiable. I will meet under the condition that no attempt will be made to dispute the legal transfer of the company or its financial decisions moving forward. My home will be returned to me immediately. Amelia's involvement with the company is terminated, effective immediately. If these conditions are not met, the next conversation will be through my legal team, and I will have no choice but to pursue a full forensic audit of all financial activity over the past 10 years. Let me know when you're ready to proceed. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. My father's name flashed across the screen, the bold white letters standing in sharp contrast against the dark background. I let it ring 3 times before answering, giving him just long enough to feel the weight of uncertainty settle in before I granted him the courtesy of a conversation. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice sharper than I had heard it in years, like a cornered animal that had finally realized escape was no longer an option. "You think you've won just because you have some papers saying you own the business, but business isn't about ownership, it's about power. And power is something you clearly don't understand." I smiled slightly, adjusting the sleeves of my blazer as I leaned back in my chair, enjoying the way his frustration was already seeping through his carefully controlled demeanor. "And yet, somehow, the power seems to be in my hands now, doesn't it?" I said, letting the words roll off my tongue slowly, deliberately, like a weapon I knew he wasn't ready to defend against. He exhaled sharply, the sound crackling through the speaker, his irritation growing more apparent with every second that passed. "I built this company from nothing," he bit out, his voice laced with barely controlled anger. "I put in the time, the sweat, the sacrifices. And now you think you can waltz in and take it all away like you're entitled to it." I let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking my head slightly at the sheer irony of his words. "It's fascinating to me how you and Amelia love throwing the word, entitled, around when neither of you has ever worked for anything a day in your lives," I said, my voice sharper now, cutting through his protest before he even had a chance to form it. "You didn't give me this company, Dad. You signed away your control because you weren't paying attention, because you assumed I would always be the obedient daughter cleaning up your messes behind the scenes." Silence. I had struck a nerve, and we both knew it. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my desk, my voice lowering as I delivered the final blow. "I didn't steal the company from you, Dad. I saved it from you." The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, the weight of my words settling over him like a heavy stone pressing against his chest. I could almost picture him sitting at his desk, rubbing his temple in frustration, trying to find a way to manipulate the situation back in his favor. But there was no way out this time, no easy fix, no daughter willing to clean up his financial disasters while he lavished Amelia with whatever she desired. Finally, he exhaled, slower this time, more controlled, as if he had just made peace with the inevitable. "You get your damn house back," he said, his voice quieter now, devoid of the same arrogance he had carried for years. "Amelia will be removed from the company immediately. But don't think for one second that this means I'm going to sit back and let you turn everything I built into something unrecognizable." I smiled, leaning back in my chair again, already knowing I had won before the conversation had even started. "I don't need your permission, Dad," I said, my tone casual, effortless, as if I were discussing the weather rather than the complete dismantling of his unchecked control. I own the company now. I'll run it the way it should have been run from the very beginning. He let out a humorless chuckle, though there was no real fight left in him anymore, just resignation. You really think you're better than me, don't you? I didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, didn't allow him a single second of doubt. No, I said simply, my voice steady, my decision absolute. I know I am. I ended the call before he could respond, letting the weight of my words hang in the air between us, the final, undeniable truth settling in with absolute certainty. For years, I had been the afterthought, the reliable one, the daughter who was expected to sacrifice and remain silent while Amelia was worshipped and my father controlled everything. But those days were over now, buried beneath the wreckage of their own arrogance, crushed under the weight of their own miscalculations. The business was mine. My house was mine. My life was mine. And for the first time in my entire existence, I wasn't just fighting to be seen. I had taken my place at the head of the table, and I wasn't ever giving it back.